Hi learners, I am Akhilesh Yu, Assistant Professor, Department of English, Sri Narayana Guru Open University. Today we are discussing discipline-specific elective course Culture Studies prescribed in the 4th semester English Language and Literature course. Let us discuss Unit 1, Block 1, Cultural Theories. In this unit, we have 4 prominent theorists whose works have had great influence in many aspects of the recent literary and cultural theories. They are Theodor Adorno, Richard Hoggart, Raymond Williams, and Stuart Hall. Before going into the details of these theories and their contributions, let me briefly introduce the emergence and or evolution of culture studies. In his keywords, Raymond Williams says, culture is one of the 2 or 3 most complicated words in English language. Of course, the word culture indeed evokes a whole universe of meanings and debates. The concept of culture originated from the Latin word cultus, referring to cultivation, care, and personal development. Early Western philosophers such as Plato and Aristotle linked culture to the cultivation of moral and intellectual virtues. Later, in the 18th and 19th centuries, the Industrial Revolution and the rise of mass culture and mass society shifted the meaning of culture, giving rise to the concept of high culture. High culture means elite intellectual, artistic achievements. And Matthew Arnold is a key figure in understanding and defining culture in the Victorian period. He defined culture as the pursuit of perfection through intellectual and artistic achievements. He wrote Culture and Anarchy in 1869. So it was a very interesting period in the history of England, or in the history of Europe, or broadly speaking, the history of the world. 1850s and 1860s introduced a lot of confusions in the minds of European psyche, where you have the publication of Origin of Species by Charles Darwin. You have the publication, that is in 1859. We have the publication of Das Kapital in 3 volumes in 1867. And within this context, people were so much confused or disillusioned to choose between science and religion, or the rural and the new industrialized urban cities. And within this disillusionment, Matthew Arnold wrote Culture and Anarchy, which gave prominence to high culture or high elite culture. In this context, Arnold's work problematized this dilemma by giving prominence to high elite culture. He said culture is like sweetness and light. He synonymously used culture with high culture. And he said culture is a system represented by democratic traditions. Or in other words, he said the best that can be thought and said. He compared the culture of the working class as anarchy. Anarchy means a system of lawlessness. So by comparing the culture of working class with anarchy, he was actually derogatorily looking at the culture of the working class. So this notion of considering culture as high culture continued till 1930s and 40s. And other writers and critics like F.R. Lewis and Q.D. Lewis followed this tradition of associating culture with elite, high-class, dominant cultures. ഇവിടെ നമ്മൾ പ്രത്യേകം ഓർക്കേണ്ട ഒരു കാര്യം, സംസ്കാരം എന്നുള്ള ഒരു പദത്തിന് വന്ന കാലകാലങ്ങളിൽ വന്ന മാറ്റങ്ങളാണ്. അപ്പം എങ്ങനെയാണ് സംസ്കാരം എന്ന് പറയുന്ന പദം പുരാതന കാലം മുതൽ ഗ്രീക്ക് റോമൻ കാലങ്ങൾ മുതൽ ആധുനിക കാലം വരെ ആ പദത്തിന് വന്ന അർത്ഥവ്യത്യാസവും പരിഗണിക്കേണ്ടതുണ്ട്. അപ്പം മുമ്പ് സംസ്കാരം എന്നത്, നമുക്ക് സംസ്കാരം എന്ന് പറയുന്നത് ഒരു പ്രത്യേക വിഭാഗത്തിൻ്റെ അല്ലെങ്കിൽ ആർക്കാണോ ഒരു സമൂഹത്തിൽ ഡിസിഷൻ മേക്കിങ്ങിന് പവറുള്ളത്, ആരാണോ സമൂഹത്തിൻ്റെ ശ്രേണിയിൽ, സാംസ്കാരിക ശ്രേണിയിൽ മുൻപന്തിയിൽ നിൽക്കുന്നത്, അവരുടെ സംസ്കാരം നമ്മുടെ എല്ലാവരുടെയും സംസ്കാരമായി മാറുന്ന ഒരു കാഴ്ചയുണ്ട്. പിന്നീടാണ് സംസ്കാരം, കൾച്ചർ ഈസ് ഓർഡിനറി പോലെയുള്ള റെയ്മണ്ട് വില്യംസിൻ്റെ കോൺസെപ്റ്റുകളിൽ കൂടിയാണ് സംസ്കാരം സർവ്വസാധാരണമാണെന്നും എല്ലാ മനുഷ്യൻ്റെയും ദൈനംദിന ജീവിതത്തിലെ പ്രവർത്തനങ്ങൾ സംസ്കാരവുമായി ബന്ധപ്പെട്ടിരിക്കുന്നു എന്നും പഠനങ്ങൾ വരുന്നത്. മാത്യു അർണോൾഡ് വിക്ടോറിയൻ കാലഘട്ടത്തിലെ സാംസ്കാരിക വ്യത്യാസങ്ങൾ, പുതിയതായി ഇൻഡസ്ട്രിയൽ റവല്യൂഷൻ വരുന്നു, ആ സമയത്ത് റൂറൽ ഏരിയസിലുള്ള മനുഷ്യർ അർബൻ ഏരിയസിലേക്ക് മൈഗ്രേറ്റ് ചെയ്യുന്നു. അങ്ങനെ മൈഗ്രേറ്റ് ചെയ്യുമ്പോൾ പുതിയൊരു വർക്കിംഗ് ക്ലാസ് എമേർജ് ചെയ്യുന്നു. ഈ വർക്കിംഗ് ക്ലാസ്സിൻ്റെ എമേർജൻസും അവർ സിറ്റികൾ പോപ്പുലേറ്റ് ചെയ്യുന്നതും മാസ് കൾച്ചറൊക്കെ അർണോൾഡിനെ വളരെയധികം ടെൻഷനിലാക്കുന്നുണ്ട്, വിഷമിപ്പിക്കുന്നുണ്ട്. അപ്പോഴാണ് ഈ കൾച്ചർ ആൻഡ് അനാർക്കി പോലെയുള്ള രചനകൾ വരുന്നത്. പിന്നീട് 30കളിലും 40കളിലും അതർ റൈറ്റേഴ്സ് ആൻഡ് ക്രിറ്റിക്സ് ലൈക്ക് F.R. ലീവീസ് ആൻഡ് Q.D. ലീവീസ് ഫോളോ ദിസ് ട്രഡീഷൻ ഓഫ് associating culture with elite, high-class, dominant culture. Especially his works like The Great Tradition exemplifies this claim. So, നമ്മളൊരു സമൂഹത്തിൽ ജീവിക്കുമ്പം the dominant culture, there are always a dominant culture and there are subcultures. So, usually the dominant culture assimilate all the subcultures. Simultaneously, the subcultures are countercultures. The primary objective of cultural studies is understanding that culture is the object of analysis and culture serves ideology too. By ideology means Pierre Machery, the Marxist thinker, says that ideology is unconsciously assimilated by the society. So culture serves ideology too. So in the 1930s and 40s, F.R. Lewis expanded Arnold's idea, stressing that literature was essential for maintaining moral integrity, and criticized the rise of mass culture after industrial revolution, and he saw it as a shallow and morally degrading. So he also emphasized the role of education in preserving cultural values. Later in the 1940s, this idea of synonymously using high culture with culture has changed with the thoughts of Theodor Adorno of the Frankfurt School. He took a more critical approach to culture. Frankfurt School is established in 1923 in the Goethe University in Frankfurt, Germany. The first generation of Frankfurt schools include Theodor Adorno, Max Horkheimer, Walter Benjamin, Erich Fromm, etc. And Habermas is one of the leading figures of the second generation of theorists. They actually tried to incorporate the Freudian psychoanalytic theory and with Marx's political economy in an attempt to explain why socialist revolutions failed in the West. And they were actually trying to attempt new political and social theories to understand and explain the changing political and social scenario of Europe. So they found it difficult for the existing theories to explain European cultural context. So Adorno defined culture as a signifying system through which a social order is communicated, reproduced, experienced, and explored. He argued that mass culture under capitalism had become a tool of social control, and how capitalism perpetuates dominant ideologies. So I have already mentioned in every culture there is a dominant culture and there are subcultures. And dominant culture always propagate dominant ideologies. Dominant ideology means the ideology of those who are in power, those who are who are near the proximity of power, those who can make decisions. So ideology is very important when you look at the term culture and culture studies as a discipline. His works, Dialectics of Enlightenment, deeply engages with such issues. In the 1950s, Raymond Williams and Richard Hoggart took up the discussion on culture. That was a pivotal moment in the history of cultural studies. Richard Hoggart's work, Uses of Literacy, published in 1957, and Raymond Williams's Culture and Society, published in 1958, became the founding influential texts of cultural studies. So, and later Center for Contemporary Culture Studies, or the CCCS, was established in Birmingham University, UK in 1964 with Richard Hoggart as its founding director. Later Stuart Hall was appointed as an associate and later in 1971 Stuart Hall became the director. So the center was known for its interdisciplinary approach, blending sociology, literature, media studies, history, and most of the academic disciplines that come under the general category called humanities. So also it intersected with issues of power, class, race, gender, and ideology. So CCCS is best known for the theorists like Stuart Hall, Raymond Williams, E.P. Thompson, and Angela McRobbie. The center's influence was also felt globally, and its ideas became central to the post-structuralist and post-colonial studies in the 1970s and 1980s. However, CCCS was formally closed in 2002 as the university restructured its departments. Despite its closure, the legacy of CCCS continues to shape culture studies, critical theory, and media theory. So, from the exalted position of culture, it now became very ordinary. കൾച്ചർ സ്റ്റഡീസിൻ്റെ തന്നെ ഒരു പ്രാധാന്യം എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞാൽ കൾച്ചർ എന്ന വാക്കിന് വന്ന വ്യത്യാസം, അത് റേമണ്ട് വില്യംസ് കീവേഡ്സിലൊക്കെ സൂചിപ്പിക്കുന്നുണ്ട്. പിന്നീട് അദ്ദേഹത്തിൻ്റെ കൾച്ചർ ആൻഡ് സൊസൈറ്റിയിലും ഇൻഡസ്ട്രിയൽ റെവല്യൂഷൻ മുതൽ മോഡേൺ ഏജ് വരെ എങ്ങനെയാണ് കൾച്ചർ, വെസ്റ്റേൺ സൊസൈറ്റിയിലെ കൾച്ചർ മാറി വന്നതെന്ന് അദ്ദേഹം സൂചിപ്പിക്കുന്നുണ്ട്. അപ്പോൾ നമ്മൾ മലയാളത്തിലൊക്കെ ഉപയോഗിക്കുന്ന സംസ്കാരമില്ലാത്തവൻ എന്നൊരു പദം അസാധ്യമാകുന്ന ഒരു രീതിയിലേക്ക് സംസ്കാര പഠനത്തിൻ്റെ പുതിയ എൻഗേജ്മെൻറ്റുകൾ വന്നു. കാര്യം എല്ലാം കൾച്ചർ ഈസ് ഓർഡിനറി, especially culture of everyday life became very prominent after the introduction of culture studies as a discipline and the establishment of CCCS at Birmingham University. Now let's move on to the contributions of four important founding figures of culture studies: Theodor Adorno, Richard Hoggart, Raymond Williams, and Stuart Hall. Their works are quintessential in understanding culture studies as a discipline. So Adorno was born in 1903 and died in 1969. He was a German philosopher, he was a sociologist, he was a musicologist. Also, Adorno was a leading member of the Frankfurt School. We have already discussed the Frankfurt School, originated in the Goethe University in Germany. And he is known for his contributions to philosophy, social theory, and cultural criticisms, particularly in the context of post-World War II capitalist societies. So capitalism actually introduced the homogenization of culture and a new culture called consumer culture. So capitalism must be understood on the basis of cultural studies. He actually fled from Nazi Germany in 1934 to the US and settled there. Adorno made significant contributions to the study of culture through his critique of mass culture. So mass culture is a culture of the working class and the culture of the masses. Their mobility is not limited, not agrarian in setting. They were settled in cities. Their mobility was not limited. They are some kind of a flotsam people. So mass culture was an after effect of industrialization in general. So industrialization introduced great changes in the society of the West. So the major concepts of Adorno that influenced culture studies are culture industry. Adorno, along with Max Horkheimer, both are part of the Frankfurt School, they developed the concept of culture industry in their influential work, The Culture Industry, Enlightenment and Mass Deception, published in 1944. So from 1940s onwards, changes were becoming more visible in understanding culture. So mass produced, actually culture industry is mass produced, technologically simulated cheap forms of entertainment, and that were going to change the entire idea of culture. Under capitalism, Adorno says that cultural products are produced in a standardized, commodified way to serve the interest of the capitalist. By doing that, what happens is that the cultural production homogenizes the culture. So the heterogeneity of the culture is not there when you are in a consumer society. Also, culture industry produce artificial needs and satisfies it. It manipulates mass consciousness by promoting conformity and distraction. So another important concept by Theodor Adorno is the negative dialectics. It opposes the traditional Hegelian approach where you have a thesis and an antithesis, and you make a synthesis that becomes the next thesis, so on and so forth. So you have to make a resolution while dealing with Hegelian dialectics where you have a thesis and an antithesis. Adorno argues that you have to oppose the traditional Hegelian approach to seek synthesis or resolution to contradictions. So in Hegel there is a thesis and an antithesis, and you need a new synthesis or a resolution for that thesis and antithesis. So Adorno argued that contradictions are intrinsic to reality and should not be resolved or subsumed into higher unity. This approach emphasizes a non-affirmative critique of society, rejecting simplistic answers and exploring complexities and contradictions. Now his most important art and aesthetic theory. Adorno discussed and wrote extensively, particularly in relation to art's role in society and its potential for resistance. His book Aesthetic Theory was published in 1970. It was published posthumously, explores how art can serve as a form of critique against the commodifying forces of society. Another important work is Dialectics of Enlightenment, which was published in 1944. Another work, Minima Moralia, Reflections from Damaged Life, published in 1951, where he shares his pessimism about the possibilities of genuine freedom and individuality in a highly commodified, alienating society. So he was very confused whether freedom is possible, whether individuality is possible in a highly commodified society. He also published books titled Aesthetic Theory in 1970 and The Negative Dialectics in 1966. So Adorno introduced new ideas into the realm of culture studies, where culture is a product, and he started thinking about how people attribute material value to culture, how culture is being associated with material value, and he introduced the idea of culture industry. Now, another important theorist and a very important figure is Richard Hoggart, who was born in 1918 and died in 2014. He lived a comparatively long period of 95 years. He was a founding director of CCC at the University of Birmingham in 1964. And his scholarship focused, and he continued his position of director of CCC till 1969. And his scholarship focused on the intersection of culture, society, and class, which became central to the CCC's approach to culture studies. Now, he is from a working class background in Leeds, and it reflected in most of his works. He studied life, culture, and society, and British popular culture in particular, especially after the World War II. So he emphasized the importance of studying everyday cultural practices. That is very important. Unlike the high culture and understanding and assimilating to high culture or the elite culture, Hoggart advocated and he emphasized the importance of studying everyday cultural practices, particularly those of working class in post-war Britain. Hoggart argues that working class people were active participants in culture, not just passive consumers. He believed popular culture, including radio, TV, and literature, played a significant role in shaping class identities and social relations. He was concerned about the mass media and consumer culture on traditional working class values and practices. So his most important work is The Uses of Literacy, which was published in 1957. It discusses the effect of mass media and popular culture on English working class people. It is broadly divided into two parts. The first part is a bit autobiographical in nature. It talks about growing up years of Richard Hoggart in the 1930s. You must think about Great Depression here, and how he grew up in a working class family. And the second part is a criticism of the contemporary popular culture in the 1950s, which discusses the overpowering effect of popular culture in working class. So mass media, radio, advertisement, capitalism, and Americanism was all his subjects of analysis. So he in a way laments that there is a loss of authenticity of the working class in the new mass popular culture. So influence of popular culture on working class was a crucial subject for him. His works include Literacy and Social Class, published in 1965, The British Working Class, Its Culture and Its Politics, published in 1970, The Image of the Working Class in 1982, Mass Media in Mass Society in 2004, Between Two Worlds in 2001, and Imagined Life in 1992, and The Ways We Live Now in 1995. Interestingly, when he became the first director of the Center for Contemporary Culture Studies, the university refused to provide the funding. Also, he is a very important figure in establishing and maintaining that Contemporary Center for Cultural Studies. Now, another important figure is Raymond Williams, who was born in 1921 and died in 1988. He was also from a working class background, which reflected in most of his works. He is a British scholar, writer, and cultural critic. He was one of the founding figures of culture studies. His contributions influenced the field of culture studies, challenging the traditional conceptions of culture, literature, and society. He defined culture as a whole way of life. That is very important. It is a whole way of life. And he famously said culture is ordinary. And this ordinariness of culture, William emphasized that culture is not the domain of high art or elite intellectualism, but it is part of everyday life. So from the exalted position of the elite class, now culture is ordinary. He said anything that is produced for a society and consumed by a society is culture. That is also very important. And he argued that culture is lived experience and practices by ordinary people in everyday life, their activities, including work, the language that they use, and the social relations that they maintain. So another important theory that he proposes is cultural materialism, which is rooted in Marxism. This approach focuses on the material conditions that shape culture or cultural products, such as economic conditions, historical conditions, and social forces that contribute to the making of cultural artifacts. Williams argued that culture and society are deeply interconnected with material conditions influencing cultural production. So when you analyze a text, you cannot avoid the material conditions that within which the cultural product is produced. So cultural products like art and literature must be studied in relation to the socio-political and economic factors. So we cannot separate culture from the means of production. That is the basic point. So this is a British counterpart of American New Historicism, and critics believed that American New Historicism was less political, while cultural materialism is highly political, rooted in Marxist theory. And you can see examples from the work of Jonathan Dollimore and Alan Sinfield, where they criticized Shakespearean canon. The title of the work is Political Shakespeare. So they critically analyzed the Elizabethan self-fashioning and how Shakespeare's work and how it works and what it does, the canon of Shakespeare. Another important idea that he proposes is structure of feeling. By structure of feeling, he means a shared, often unarticulated emotional and experiential domain of a particular era. So collective lived experience and emotions that existed in a particular era. And his most important work is Culture and Society, published in 1958, which traces the evolution of the concept of culture in British society from Industrial Revolution to the 20th century. It critiques the idealist and elitist view of culture and calls for a broader and more inclusive understanding. His another important work is The Long Revolution, published in 1961, and in 1976 he published a very important work titled Keywords, A Vocabulary of Culture and Society. And this is a seminal work that analyzes the meanings and histories of important cultural and social terms such as culture, democracy, class, and individualism. And another work that published in 1977 is Marxism and Literature, where he introduces the concept of cultural materialism. And an interesting work by Raymond Williams is The Country and the City, published in 1973, where Williams examines the contrasting themes of rural and urban life in English literature, analyzing how the city and countryside have been represented and how it reflects social and cultural change. So that is Raymond Williams. Now, very important figure in the history of culture studies is Stuart Hall, who is a Jamaican-born British cultural theorist and sociologist, whose works have had great influence in many aspects of the recent literary and cultural theories. He was born in 1932 and died in 2014. He was a founder of the journal The New Left Review, and that made a lot of debates and discussions on culture, literature, society, and critical theory. He played a pivotal role in developing the field of culture studies at the University of Birmingham and was instrumental in theorizing the relationship between culture, power, and society. He studied culture on the basis of communication theories that he developed, where the most important theory is encoding and decoding. As the word signifies, encoding is the production of a message using verbal and non-verbal signs. You produce a message, whether it is an advertisement or a film or anything, you produce the message, and that process is called encoding. And decoding is the understanding and comprehension of the message by the receiver or the audience. And that is actually based on his or her knowledge and cultural background and experience. നമ്മൾ ഒരു ലിറ്റററി വർക്ക് വായിക്കുന്ന സമയത്ത് അത് വായനക്കാരൻ്റെ അറിവിൻ്റെയും കഴിവിൻ്റെയും അയാളുടെ പ്രത്യയശാസ്ത്രപരമായിട്ടുള്ള ബോധത്തിൻ്റെ അടിസ്ഥാനത്തിൽ അതിൻ്റെ ചിത്രം വലുതായിക്കൊണ്ടിരിക്കും. പ്രത്യേകിച്ച് ഇപ്പോൾ ഉദാഹരണത്തിന് നമ്മൾ ഒരു സാധാരണ വായനക്കാരനെ സംബന്ധിച്ചിടത്തോളം ചങ്ങമ്പുഴയുടെ രമണൻ ഒരു പ്രണയ കവിതയാകുമ്പോൾ കുറച്ചും കൂടി ഡീപ്പായി വായിക്കുന്ന ഒരാളെ സംബന്ധിച്ചിടത്തോളം ആ കവിതയിലെ പ്രധാന പ്രശ്നം അതിലെ ക്ലാസ് ഡിഫറൻസ് ആണ്. കാര്യം അതിലെ രമണൻ ഒരു വർക്കിംഗ് ക്ലാസ് മനുഷ്യനും ചന്ദ്രിക എന്ന് പറയുന്ന നായിക ഒരു പൈസയുള്ള വീട്ടിൽ, അല്ലെങ്കിൽ ഹാവ്സ് ആൻഡ് ഹാവ് നോട്ട്സ്, ദർ ഇസ് എ ഡിസ്റ്റിങ്ഷൻ ബിറ്റ്വീൻ എക്കണോമിക് ക്ലാസ്സസ്. അപ്പോൾ അതിനൊരു മാർക്സിസ്റ്റ് റീഡിങ് സാധ്യമാണെന്ന് കുറച്ചും കൂടെ ഐഡിയോളജിക്കൽ സെൻസ് ഉള്ളവർക്ക്, ഒരു മാർക്സിസ്റ്റ് ഓവർവ്യൂ ഉള്ളവർക്ക് മനസ്സിലാവും. അപ്പോൾ ഇങ്ങനെ ഡീകോഡിംഗ് എന്ന് പറയുന്നത് എപ്പോഴും റിസീവറുടെ ബോധത്തിൻ്റെയും വിവരത്തിൻ്റെയും കോംപ്രിഹെൻഡ് ചെയ്യാനുള്ള ശേഷിയുടെ അടിസ്ഥാനത്തിൽ വലുതാവും. അപ്പോൾ ഈ ഡീകോഡിങ്ങിനെ, എൻകോഡിംഗ് ആൻഡ് ഡീകോഡിങ്ങിൽ സ്റ്റുവർട്ട് ഹോൾ ഡീകോഡിങ്ങിനെ മൂന്നായി തിരിക്കുന്നുണ്ട്. There are three ways by which you can decode or read a material that is already encoded. The one is dominant or hegemonic reading, where you accept anything that is encoded in the message. And now the negotiated reading, where you accept it partially and you resist it to a certain extent. അതൊരു മിഡിൽ വേ ആണ്. പൂർണ്ണമായും നമ്മൾ അക്സെപ്റ്റ് ചെയ്യുന്നില്ല. അതാണ് നെഗോഷിയേറ്റഡ് റീഡിംഗ് എന്ന് പറയുന്നത്. ഇനി അത് ഓപ്പോസിഷണൽ റീഡിംഗ് ആണ്. വി റിജക്റ്റ് ഇറ്റ്. സിനിമകൾ 90s മലയാളം സിനിമകളെ പറ്റി ആലോചിച്ചാൽ അത് മുന്നോട്ട് വെക്കുന്ന പാട്രിയാർക്കൽ ഇൻഡോക്ട്രിനേഷൻസിനെയൊക്കെ നമ്മൾ ഒരു കാലത്ത് മനസ്സിലാക്കുകയും അങ്ങനെ തന്നെ അക്സെപ്റ്റ് ചെയ്യുക, ഡോമിനൻ്റ് ഹെജമോണിക് ഐഡിയോളജി അക്സെപ്റ്റ് ചെയ്യുന്നു, പിന്നീട് നമ്മളതിനെ നെഗോഷിയേറ്റ് ചെയ്ത് വായിക്കുന്നു. ഇപ്പോഴൊക്കെ നമ്മൾ പൂർണ്ണമായും അതിനെ തള്ളിക്കളയുന്ന ഒരു ചരിത്രം കൂടി നമ്മൾ ഈ കൂട്ടത്തിൽ ചേർത്ത് വെച്ച് ആലോചിക്കണം. അപ്പോൾ encoding and decoding is a very important concept proposed by Stuart Hall, where you encode a message according to your ideology and your target. And decoding is from the part of the audience, where I can decode or read it in three different ways. First is dominant reading, second one is negotiated reading, and the third one is oppositional reading. In dominant reading, you accept the dominant ideology in the cultural product. The second one, you partially accept it and reject certain parts of it. And the third part is oppositional reading, where you totally reject the message. And his another important concept is cultural circuits, where culture is where he considers culture as not a one-way transmission from the producer to the audience. Instead, it is a dynamic circuit where meanings are negotiated, contested, and re-articulated in various points in the circuit. അപ്പോൾ കൾച്ചർ ഒരു കൾച്ചറൽ സർക്യൂട്ടിനെ പറ്റി അദ്ദേഹം പറയുന്നുണ്ട്. അവിടെ പലതരം റെപ്രസെൻറ്റേഷൻ, ഐഡൻറ്റിറ്റി, ഇങ്ങനെ ഒരുപാട് ഘടകങ്ങൾ അതിനകത്തുണ്ട്. അപ്പോൾ അത് ഒരു വൺ വേ ട്രാഫിക് അല്ല അവിടുത്തെ കമ്മ്യൂണിക്കേഷൻ. അപ്പോൾ അതിൻ്റെ ഓഡിയൻറ്റിൻ്റെ കൾച്ചറൽ ബാക്ക്ഗ്രൗണ്ട്, അയാളുടെ ഐഡിയോളജിക്കൽ പൊസിഷൻസ്, അയാളുടെ നോളജ് പാരഡൈംസ്, അതൊക്കെ ആയിട്ട് ബന്ധപ്പെട്ടിരിക്കുന്നു എന്നുള്ളത്. അപ്പോൾ എൻകോഡിങ് ആൻഡ് ഡീകോഡിങ്ങിൻ്റെ ഒരു കണ്ടിന്യൂവേഷനായിട്ട് നമുക്ക് കൾച്ചറൽ സർക്യൂട്ടിനെ കാണാം. Now, cultural texts like TV, film can be actively interpreted and redefined by audiences in ways that challenge dominant cultural ideological method. So, cultural circuit describe the flow of cultural products and meanings across different stages of production. So, there is a circuit of production, consumption, and interpretation. Now, another important concept by Stuart Hall is articulation. Hall argues that ideas, practices, and identities are not fixed, but are articulated in ways that can change over time. അപ്പോൾ നമ്മളുടെ ആശയങ്ങളും മറ്റും അതങ്ങനെ ഇറ്റ് ഈസ് നോട്ട് ആൾറെഡി ദെയർ, ബട്ട് വി ആർട്ടിക്കുലേറ്റ് ഇറ്റ്. സോ ആർട്ടിക്കുലേഷൻ ഹെൽപ്സ് ടു എക്സ്പ്ലെയിൻ ഹൗ ideological formations such as race, gender, or nationalism can shift, adapt, and combine in different historical and cultural contexts. അപ്പോൾ എങ്ങനെയാണ് നമ്മൾ, ഇറ്റ് ഈസ് നോട്ട് ദെയർ, കൾച്ചർ ഈസ് നോട്ട് ദെയർ, or cultural product is not there, or an ideology is not there, an idea is not there, but it is being articulated. നമ്മൾ തന്നെയാണ് അത് ആർട്ടിക്കുലേറ്റ് ചെയ്യുന്നത് എന്നാണ് പറയുന്നത്. Stuart Hall's major works include encoding and decoding in the television discourse in 1973, culture studies 2 paradigms published in 1980, and popular arts published in 1964, which is co-authored with Paddy Vanel. So, to sum up with, culture studies as a discipline emerged at the Birmingham University as CCCS, Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies, with Richard Hoggart as its founding director, and Raymond Williams associated with it. Then Stuart Hall became the director. So one thing that you must keep in mind while discussing culture studies is that in culture studies, the object of analysis is culture. Whenever we articulate the very term culture, it serves ideology too. നമ്മുടെ നാട്ടിലേക്ക് ഒരു കോണ്ടെക്സ്റ്റ് ആലോചിച്ച്, in every culture there is a dominant ideology, and there are ആ dominant ideology മറ്റ് കൾച്ചേഴ്സിനെ, അല്ലെങ്കിൽ ഡോമിനൻറ്റ് കൾച്ചർ സബ് കൾച്ചേഴ്സിനെ അസിമിലേറ്റ് ചെയ്യുന്ന ഒരു കോണ്ടെക്സ്റ്റ് ഉണ്ട്. ഇപ്പോൾ നമ്മളുടെ ടെക്സ്റ്റ് എന്ന് പറയുന്ന എനി റെപ്രസെൻറ്റേഷൻ ഈസ് എ ടെക്സ്റ്റ്, വെദർ ഇറ്റ് ഈസ് എൻ അഡ്വർടൈസ്മെൻറ്റ് ഓർ എ ഫിലിം ഓർ എ മ്യൂസിക് പീസ്. ഇതിനകത്തൊക്കെ സാംസ്കാരികമായിട്ടുള്ള പ്രതിനിധാനങ്ങളുണ്ടാകും. അത് കാലാകാലങ്ങളായി ഡോമിനൻ്റ് ഐഡിയോളജീസ്, അതുപോലെ തന്നെ ആ സമയത്ത് നിലനിൽക്കുന്ന കൾച്ചറൽ പ്രാക്ടീസസുമായി ബന്ധപ്പെട്ടിരിക്കും. അപ്പോൾ കൾച്ചർ സെർവ്സ് ഐഡിയോളജി ടു. ഇപ്പോൾ സംസ്കാരം, നമ്മുടെ സംസ്കാരം എന്ന് പറയുന്നത് അത് നമ്മുടെ മാത്രമല്ല, അത് കാലാകാലം. അതുപോലെ തന്നെ നോ കൾച്ചർ ഈസ് പ്യുവർ. ഒരു കൾച്ചറും പ്യുവർ അല്ല. എവറി കൾച്ചർ ഈസ് പോറസ്. There are vulnerable points through which other cultures can interact with your culture. So contemporary culture studies defines culture studies as the cultural politics of difference, where cultural identity is the set of cultural constructs like race, gender, class, religion, language, etc. So in culture studies, object of analysis is culture. Culture serves ideology too. No culture is pure, every culture is porous, and culture may interact. There is no homogeneous culture, all cultures are heterogeneous. So there are cross cultures, trans cultures. So you must think about culture studies as a recent discipline which emerged in the 1960s as an academic discipline. But culture എന്ന് പറയുന്ന വാക്കിൻ്റെ ഒരു ചരിത്രം എടുത്താൽ തന്നെ കൾച്ചർ സ്റ്റഡീസിൻ്റെ ഒരു പ്രാധാന്യം നമുക്ക് മനസ്സിലാവും. കൾച്ചർ എന്ന് പറയുന്ന വാക്ക് ആദ്യ കാലഘട്ടത്തിൽ ദോസ് ഹു ആർ ദ സെൻറ്റർ ഓഫ് പവർ, അധികാര കേന്ദ്രങ്ങൾ, ഡിസിഷൻ മേക്കിംഗ് തുടങ്ങിയ കാര്യങ്ങൾ കൈകാര്യം ചെയ്തിരുന്ന എലീറ്റ് ക്ലാസിൻ്റെ കൾച്ചറിനെ നമ്മൾ സംസ്കാരമെന്ന് വിശ്വസിക്കുകയും പിന്നീട് ഈ തിയറിസ്റ്റുകളുടെ, അതായത് റെയ്മണ്ട് വില്യംസ്, റിച്ചാർഡ് ഹൊഗാറ്റ്, സ്റ്റുവർട്ട് ഹാൾ പോലെയുള്ള എസ്പെഷ്യലി തിയോഡോർ, അഡോണോ പോലെയുള്ള തിയറിസ്റ്റുകൾ ഇതിനെ കൾച്ചർ ഇസ് ഓർഡിനറി, എല്ലാ മനുഷ്യരുടെയും സംസ്കാരം പരിഗണിക്കപ്പെടേണ്ടതും പഠിക്കപ്പെടേണ്ടതുമാണെന്ന് കൂടി പറയുന്നുണ്ട്. സോ കൾച്ചർ സ്റ്റഡീസ് ഇസ് ദ കൾച്ചറൽ പോളിറ്റിക്സ് ഓഫ് ഡിഫറൻസ്. സോ ദാറ്റ് ഈസ് ദ introductory unit where we have four major theories. Let me conclude. The first one is Theodor Adorno. He was totally against the Matthew Arnold's idea of culture is the like sweetness and light, or culture is high culture. He synonymously used high culture with culture, but Theodor Adorno introduced the idea of culture industry and culture as a signifying system. So he introduced concepts, negative dialectics. Later we have Richard Hoggart, who was from a working class background, who studied working class culture and how the consumer culture affects the authentic working class culture. He was very much interested in working class culture and the culture of the everyday. And we have Raymond Williams, who introduced the idea of culture is ordinary and the ordinariness of culture, and culture is the whole way of life. And later we have Stuart Hall, where he introduced his idea of encoding and decoding, and how decoding becomes more important than encoding, and his concept of cultural circuits. So these four theories were pivotal in the understanding of culture and establishment of the CCCS, the Center for Contemporary Culture Studies. Thank you.